This isn't written about in history textbooks, but this information changes our understanding of World War II. Now I'm going to tell you about 6 ways to keep warm and sleep in tents and trenches. The cold was as much an enemy as the one sitting in the trench opposite. It penetrated through the greatcoat, crept under the undershirt, and chilled the bones, making no distinction between ranks and armies. In the icy hell of the Eastern Front or in the damp trenches of the Ardennes, sleep was not rest, but a luxury, and the struggle for it became a separate daily battle. Soldiers' wits, honed to the limit by harsh necessity, gave rise to dozens of tricks. This was not a war for territory, but for a few degrees of warmth, for the opportunity to close one's eyes and not freeze. There was no room for romance here, only the harsh physics of survival. These methods were not taught in academies, but were passed on in whispers and frozen dugouts. They were as simple as life itself, and just as important. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn the simplest, almost instinctive method of collective survival that soldiers used to survive the most severe frosts. What if I told you that everything you believed about how to keep warm wasn't entirely true? It wasn't the clothes themselves that kept soldiers warm, but the air they trapped. This was the main secret to survival, intuitively understood by every soldier on the front lines. The cabbage principle, or layering, was the alpha and omega of fighting the cold. It all started with underwear. Ideally, it should have been clean and, most importantly, dry. Any moisture on the body instantly turned into an ice pack, drawing out precious heat. Soldiers of all armies sometimes valued a change of underwear more than an extra can of stew. The second layer was a vest or wool sweater. Wool was preferred over cotton because it continued to warm even when slightly damp. Each layer created a new air gap, a barrier against the cold. Then came a quilted jacket or tunic. Soviet quilted jackets, quilted vests, became a true legend. They were lightweight, did not restrict movement, and kept the heat in perfectly. American soldiers had their field jackets. The British had their greatcoats, but the principle remained the same. The problem arose when there were too many layers. During forced marches or digging trenches, soldiers sweated. This moisture coming from the inside was just as dangerous as the moisture from the outside. Wet clothes in the cold meant certain death. Therefore, experienced fighters knew that it was better to freeze a little while moving than to sweat. They unbuttoned their collars or even took off their top layer before heavy physical work. Drying clothes was a separate science. Most often, they were dried directly on the body using the warmth of their own bodies. Wet foot cloths or socks were placed under the undershirt at night, waking up in the morning dry. Anything that could add another layer was used. Newspapers found in ruined houses were placed under clothing. American soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge valued captured German greatcoats. This multi-layered cocoon was a fragile protection. It required constant attention and care. Keeping it dry was the main task of the day. Multi-layering was not a tactic, but a way of life. It allowed soldiers to regulate their microclimate by adapting to changing conditions. This skill directly determined whether they would wake up tomorrow. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about how modern clothing technology would have changed the life of a soldier in that war? Write about it in the comments. Want to know the secret that turned one piece of clothing into a home, a blanket, and a shield? A soldier's overcoat was more than just a uniform. It was a universal survival tool, a soldier's faithful companion in mud, snow, and under fire. Its long hem and thick cloth were designed not for parades, but for the harsh life in the trenches. The material from which the overcoats were sewn was heavy, coarse, but incredibly warm. It was windproof and could withstand light rain or snow. In the Soviet Army, the overcoat was a cult item, and its role behind the back became as much a symbol of a soldier as a rifle. The cut of the overcoat was thought out to the smallest detail. It was spacious enough to be worn over a quilted jacket in all equipment. The long hem protected the legs almost to the boots, which was critically important when standing guard for long periods of time. On the march, the greatcoat was worn rolled up and slung over the shoulder. This roll itself served as additional protection. It could soften the blow of shrapnel, or at least protect the back from the icy wind. At night, the roll became a pillow or a mat, but more often the greatcoat was used as a blanket. Huddled in the corner of the dugout, the soldier covered himself with it, trying to conserve every joule of heat. This is where the famous soldier's life hack was born. To warm up faster, soldiers would raise the high collar of their overcoats and breathe directly into it. The warm, moist air they exhaled did not escape into the frosty nothingness, but remained inside. This technique created a small, warm cocoon around the face and neck. The warmth from their breath warmed the fabric, and the fabric, in turn, gave off heat to the body. It was a closed cycle that allowed them to quickly warm at least the upper part of their torso. Breathing into the collar also helped warm frozen hands. They could be tucked under the overcoat on the chest and breathe on, quickly restoring sensitivity to the fingers. This was important before a battle or when cleaning weapons. Of course, this method had its drawbacks. Constant moisture caused the inside of the collar to become covered with frost. But in conditions where the temperature dropped to -30, it was a small price to pay for a few minutes of life-saving warmth. The overcoat was a soldier's little fortress. It smelled of sweat, gunpowder, and the home he had left behind. Wrapping himself in it meant momentarily shielding himself from the icy horror of war. What modern piece of equipment do you think could compare to a soldier's overcoat in terms of versatility? In the next chapter, I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of trench camaraderie, which literally warmed soldiers from the inside and outside. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret that was not written about in reports and summaries. In a war where life was devalued with each passing day, physical intimacy between men was absolutely taboo. However, the cold erased these conventions faster than artillery fire. Sleeping together, or huddling as the Americans called it, became an unspoken law of survival. The physics of this method is simple. One body gives off a certain amount of heat, but most of it dissipates into space. 2 or 3 bodies pressed together lose much less heat and warm each other at the same time. This was the most reliable and accessible source of heat when the stoves went out and the firewood ran out. In a frozen dugout or shallow trench, soldiers lay down in a row, like sardines in a can. It was not a question of comfort, but a matter of life and death. Often soldiers would lie down in groups of 3 or 4. Those on the edges would freeze faster. Therefore, there was an unspoken rotation. After an hour or 2, those on the edges would move to the center, and those who had warmed up would take their place. This rotation allowed the entire unit to maintain its strength. It required discipline and trust. Everyone understood that today he was warming his comrade, and tomorrow his comrade would warm him. Sometimes 2 or 3 greatcoats were spread on the bottom of the trench, and 2 others were used to cover the top. The result was an improvised collective sleeping bag. In such a nest, it was possible to withstand even the most severe frost. The psychological effect was no less important than the physical one. In the icy darkness, listening to the breathing of a comrade nearby, a soldier no longer felt alone. The feeling of a friend's shoulder gave the illusion of security and home. This practice was universal. Soviet soldiers, American GIs, British Tommies, they all used this primitive method to keep warm. It erased differences in language and culture, remaining pure physiology of survival. It was the highest manifestation of frontline camaraderie. Sharing the last warmth of your body was more intimate than sharing your last cigarette. It was a connection that could only arise there, on the very edge. Many veterans recall this reluctantly, but acknowledge that without it, they would not have survived. The simple act of touching another living person was the most powerful weapon against the impersonal and all-consuming cold. What if everything you were taught about snow is outdated? Snow is not cold, it is a blanket. This paradox was well known to any soldier who fought in winter. The most reliable way to shelter from the cold was to go underground or under the snow, using nature as an ally. A soldier's first instinct in any unfamiliar situation was to dig in. Initially, this was done to protect against bullets and shrapnel, but it quickly became clear that the earth protects not only from steel, but also from the cold. At a depth of 1 to 2 meters, the temperature of the earth was always consistently higher than on the surface. Even in severe frost, it rarely dropped below zero. Therefore, the deeper the trench or dugout, the warmer it was inside. Simple rifle pits did not provide such protection. The real salvation was the foxholes, narrow crevices dug into the wall of the trench. You could climb into them and hide from the wind and frost. But the pinnacle of trench construction was, of course, the dugout or dugout. It was no longer just a trench, but a real underground house. Its construction was hard work, but it paid off handsomely. The walls were reinforced with logs and the floor was covered with boards or branches. The roof was made of several layers of logs covered with a thick layer of earth. This construction was almost invulnerable to the cold. The main enemies in the dugout were the lack of oxygen and smoke from the stove, but that was the price to pay for warmth. Properly organized ventilation was as important in art as fortification. When it was impossible to dig frozen ground, snow was used. Soldiers dug entire caves and trenches in deep snowdrifts. Loose snow retains air well and is an excellent heat insulator. The entrance to such a snow dugout or burrow was always covered. A raincoat, a piece of tarpaulin, or simply a greatcoat was used for this purpose. The main task was to keep the icy wind out. The floor in any shelter was critically important. Sleeping on the bare ground, even in a dugout, was not an option. In the next chapter, we will talk about what soldiers used to make their mattresses. How do you think a modern soldier, accustomed to technology, would be able to survive in conditions that require such earthwork skills? Sleeping on the frozen ground meant that you were guaranteed not to wake up in the morning. The body, in contact with the icy surface, lost heat at a catastrophic rate. Therefore, creating an insulating bedding was the second most important task after digging a shelter. The most accessible and effective material was spruce or pine branches. Soldiers broke off the lower branches of trees and laid them in several layers on the floor of the dugout or the bottom of the trench. This was a task that was carried out methodically and carefully. The branches created a springy and, more importantly, air-filled layer. It prevented the body from coming into contact with the ground. In addition, the needles gave off a strong smell that overpowered the heavy odor of unwashed bodies and dampness in the dugout. This method was especially popular with Soviet soldiers and partisans fighting in wooded areas. Entire units went out to harvest pine branches. This seemingly peaceful work was as much a part of combat training as shooting. If there were no forests nearby, anything that could create a layer was used. In steppe areas or in Europe, soldiers looked for straw. They stuffed it into empty sacks if they had any, or simply spread it out in a thick layer. Straw had a serious drawback. It quickly absorbed moisture and began to rot. Such bedding had to be changed frequently, otherwise it itself became a source of cold and dampness. But there was often no choice.
Even in Europol's plains.
In urban combat, any fabric that could be found was used. Soldiers dragged mattresses, carpets, and curtains from bombed-out houses into basements. This was a real stroke of luck that could provide a few nights of relative comfort. Newspapers were a surprising but effective insulator. German, Soviet, American, it didn't matter. Soldiers put them under their undershirts and spread them on the floor. Dry paper retained heat well, although it was short-lived. A raincoat or any piece of tarpaulin was a must. It was laid down under pine branches or straw to block the dampness coming from the ground. This rubberized piece of fabric was worth its weight in gold. The constant search for dry bedding was a routine concern for soldiers. They dragged reeds, dry grass, and leaves into their burrows. Anything that could be placed between the body and the icy ground. This trench mattress was as much a part of the fortifications as the parapet. It protected not from bullets but from the cold, but that did not make it any less important. Guess which everyday item was worth its weight in gold in the trenches? An ordinary brick. Every soldier in the trenches dreamed of having a potbelly stove, but it was often impossible to light one on the front line. The smoke instantly gave away their position, attracting artillery or mortar fire. A way was needed to get heat without smoke or fire, and the soldiers found it. They used the principle of heat accumulation. Stones, or even better, bricks from destroyed stoves were ideal for this. The method was simple. Behind the unit, where it was safe to build a fire, several bricks or large stones were placed in the fire. They were heated for several hours until they were red hot. Then these hot batteries were quickly wrapped in several layers of cloth or burlap. This was done first to avoid burns, and second, to slow down the release of heat. The finished warmers were distributed to posts and rifle cells. Such a brick tucked under a greatcoat or in the feet could give off heat for 2 to 3 hours. For a soldier on guard duty who could not move, these hours were a real salvation. They allowed him to maintain sensitivity in his toes and fingers. This method was actively used by snipers, who had to lie motionless in their hides for many hours. They prepared such a hot water bottle in advance and took it with them to their position. This allowed them to work even in the most severe frost. When bricks were not available, they used flasks or kettles with boiling water. They also wrapped them tightly in cloth. Water cooled faster than stone, but it was enough for an hour or an hour and a half. Some craftsmen made chemical warmers. They mixed quicklime with water in an airtight jar. A violent reaction began, releasing heat. It was dangerous but effective. This principle of slow heat was one of the keys to survival. It was not necessary to heat the entire dugout. It was enough to warm one person locally so that they could perform their combat task. Soldiers' ingenuity found warmth where it seemed to be absent. In the next chapter, we will talk about how to get not only heat, but also light using literally garbage. How effective do you think such a simple brick could be compared to modern chemical heaters? The long winter nights in the trenches were not only cold, but also pitch black. Any source of light was a luxury and at the same time, a deadly danger. The flame of a match or lantern could be spotted by a sniper from hundreds of meters away. Soldiers needed a light source that was dim, safe, and ideally provided a little warmth. A solution was found and named the trench candle. It was sometimes called the Hindenburg candle, after the German field marshal, as the Germans had used them in World War I. The design was ingenious in its simplicity. A strip of corrugated cardboard was tightly rolled into an empty tin can or shell casing. This cardboard roll served as a large, thick wick. Then melted paraffin, wax, or any other combustible fat was poured into the can. The paraffin soaked into the cardboard. After it solidified, it became a large, long-burning candle. Such a device burned for a very long time, several hours. It gave off an even, dim flame, which was enough to light a small dugout. Most importantly, it produced almost no smoke. This candle was not only a source of light, it also gave off noticeable heat. Of course, it could not heat the dugout, but it was enough to warm frozen hands. The flame of such a candle could even be used to warm a mug of tea or heat up a can of food. To do this, a simple wire stand was constructed over the can. It was a real luxury. The production of such candles was often organized in the rear. Volunteers and even school children collected candle stubs, tin cans, and cardboard, sending thousands of these simple heaters to the front. Soldiers made them themselves. They collected candle remnants and melted fat from canned meat. Any combustible material was used. The trench candle became a symbol of soldiers' everyday life. It was a small point of light and warmth in the icy darkness of war. It allowed soldiers to write letters home, clean their weapons, or simply see the faces of their comrades. This small flame sustained not only physical strength, but also morale. It was proof that even in the most hopeless darkness, a source of light could be found. In the battle against the cold, the front line was the extremities. A soldier could withstand the cold as long as he could feel his fingers and toes. As soon as they froze, he very quickly lost his combat effectiveness and then his life. Taking care of one's feet was a ritual that became automatic. Experienced soldiers knew that wet feet were the beginning of the end. Therefore, the most valuable treasure in the trenches was a pair of dry socks or footcloths. Incidentally, Soviet footcloths, for all their archaic nature, had an advantage over socks. They were easier to dry. An unfolded footcloth could be dried on the body under a shirt much faster than a woolen sock. Soldiers dried wet footcloths or socks by putting them under their shirts at night. They went to bed in damp clothes but woke up in dry ones. The warmth of their own bodies was the only dryer available. Footwear was the second problem. Boots or shoes had to be loose. They were taken a size or two larger so that 2 pairs of footcloths could be worn, or the shoes could be stuffed with straw for extra insulation. Shoes that were too tight impaired blood circulation, and feet froze instantly. German soldiers suffered greatly at the beginning of the war on the Eastern Front because of their tight-fitting uniform boots. Protecting the hands was no less important. Mittens were warmer than gloves because the fingers kept each other warm, but gloves were more convenient for shooting. Soldiers often compromised. They wore mittens but cut off the index finger to pull the trigger. Sometimes gloves were worn under mittens. The head was another source of heat loss. The Soviet Ushanka hat was recognized by soldiers of all armies as one of the best headgear for cold weather. Americans used knitted balaclavas. A scarf was a universal savior. It was wrapped around the neck and used to cover the face from the icy wind. The scarf protected the cheeks and nose from frostbite. This constant, tedious struggle to keep the extremities dry was as much a part of war as shooting. Neglecting these rules put soldiers out of action just as badly as enemy bullets. Keeping warm from the inside was no less important than keeping warm from the outside. A frozen and hungry soldier is not a fighter. Therefore, delivering hot food to the front lines was one of the main tasks of the rear services. The legendary field kitchen was the heart of the regiment. The smoke from its chimney was a symbol of life and hope for the soldiers. The army cook was no less important than the commander. The problem was how to deliver hot food from the rear to the trenches. This was usually done at night, under enemy fire. The soldiers who carried the thermoses on their backs were true heroes. The thermos was a strategic invention. It allowed soup or porridge to be kept hot for several hours. Getting your mess tin of hot food in a frozen trench was the greatest happiness. When centralized delivery was impossible, soldiers heated their food themselves. They used the trench candles we mentioned earlier, or improvised stoves, such as the British Tommy Cooker, a tin can with a wick soaked in fat. Hot tea was a universal currency in medicine. Strong, sweet, and scalding, it instantly got the blood flowing. It invigorated better than any stimulant and gave the body the energy it needed. High-calorie food was fuel for the body. Lard, sugar, chocolate, fatty canned food. All of these were worth their weight in gold. The body expended a tremendous amount of energy just to keep warm. We cannot fail to mention the famous Narcom's 100 grams. Vodka provided only a short-lived illusion of warmth. It dilated the blood vessels on the surface of the skin, which led to even greater heat loss. However, its psychological effect was enormous. A sip of alcohol before an attack took away the fear, and in the evening, it helped to relax and forget oneself for a short time. The struggle for hot food was as desperate as the struggle for ammunition. It was the fuel for war, without which even the most perfect army mechanism would simply freeze in place. The cold attacks not only the body but also the mind. It slowly saps the will, plunging a person into apathy. In this struggle, psychological fortitude was the last line of defense. The main weapon against despair was routine. Soldiers methodically cleaned their weapons, even if they were already clean. They shaved with ice-cold water, wrote letters, and mended their clothes. These simple, almost peaceful activities created the illusion of order in a world where absolute chaos reigned. They prevented the mind from sinking into darkness. They structured time, which seemed to have frozen in an icy eternity. Comradeship at the front was another source of inner fire. The knowledge that you were not alone, that there was a comrade nearby who would cover you and share his last, warmed you better than any stove. Black trench humor was a defensive reaction of the psyche. Soldiers joked about death, the cold, and the absurdity of their situation. This laughter in the face of the inevitable was a form of protest and proof that they were not broken. Letters from home were a thin thread connecting the soldier to normal life. A photograph of a wife or children, kept close to the heart, was a powerful talisman. Thoughts of home gave them the strength to endure. Soldiers read these letters dozens of times until the paper wore thin at the folds. They wrote replies, often not knowing if they would ever arrive. This dialogue with the past was a dialogue with hope. Even in the most inhuman conditions, soldiers tried to preserve their humanity. They decorated their dugouts as best they could. They sang songs during moments of calm. This inner fire, this will to live, was perhaps the most important secret to survival. Equipment, clothing, food, all of these things were important. But without this psychological resilience, everything else was useless. It was this unyielding spirit that was the last line of defense that the icy enemy could not overcome. We have looked at just a few of the ways that help soldiers survive in the inhuman conditions of the cold. These techniques, born of soldierly ingenuity, show us the unvarnished side of war. It was a daily exhausting struggle for the right to breathe, move, and simply live. Each of these methods, from breathing into a greatcoat to sleeping collectively, was a small victory of man over the elements. They show that heroism was manifested not only in attacks, but also in quiet, stubborn resistance to circumstances. This is a story not about steel, but about the resilience of the human spirit. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. It is important for us to know which pages of history you find most interesting. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our new research.